You think living on Mars is an engineering problem. Build a habitat, seal it, pressurize it, grow food inside, generate power, recycle air and water. Difficult, yes, but solvable. Engineers solve difficult problems. We've built submarines that dive miles deep, space stations that orbit Earth, bases in Antarctica. Surely we can build a base on Mars. That's the narrative. That's what you hear in presentations, documentaries, mission proposals. Mars colonization is framed as a series of engineering challenges. Hard, expensive, requiring innovation, but fundamentally achievable. Just a matter of technology, funding, and will. Except it's not an engineering problem. It's a physics problem. And physics does not negotiate. It does not care about innovation or funding or human ambition. Physics sets boundaries that cannot be bypassed with better materials or smarter designs. And Mars, as a physical environment, is so hostile to human biology that the idea of people living there long term is not just difficult, it is fundamentally at odds with how human bodies work. Let me show you why. Start with the atmosphere, or rather, the lack of it. Mars has an atmosphere. Technically, it's about 95% carbon dioxide, with traces of nitrogen and argon. But the critical number is not the composition, it's the pressure. Earth's atmospheric pressure at sea level is about 101,000 pascals, one standard atmosphere. That's the pressure your body is designed for. Your lungs, your blood, your cells, everything evolved under that pressure. Mars's atmospheric pressure at the surface is about 600 pascals. That is 0.6% of Earth's pressure, less than 1%. For practical purposes, it is a vacuum. You cannot breathe it, not because it's carbon dioxide. You cannot breathe it because there is not enough of it. Even if the atmosphere were pure oxygen, the pressure is so low that your lungs could not extract enough to survive. The partial pressure of oxygen would be far below the minimum needed to sustain consciousness. But it's worse than that. At 600 pascals, liquids boil, not because it's hot, because pressure and boiling point are connected. Water boils when its vapor pressure exceeds the surrounding atmospheric pressure. On Earth, at sea level, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. On Mars at 600 pascals, water boils at about 5 degrees Celsius. That's just above freezing. Any liquid water exposed to the Martian atmosphere will immediately start to boil, regardless of temperature. Not because it's being heated, because the pressure is too low to keep it liquid. This is called the Armstrong limit. It's the altitude on Earth, or the pressure, below which water boils at human body temperature. On Earth, that's about 19 kilometers up, where the pressure drops to around 6,000 pascals. On Mars, you're already below that limit, just standing on the surface. What does that mean for a human body? If you stepped onto the surface of Mars without a pressure suit, the fluids in your body would start to boil. Not your blood, initially. Blood is inside a closed circulatory system, under internal pressure from your heart. But the moisture in your mouth, your lungs, your eyes, the mucous membranes, all of that would begin to vaporize. Your soft tissues would swell as the water inside them turned to gas. This is called ebulism. You would lose consciousness in about 15 seconds from lack of oxygen. You would die within a minute or two, not from the cold, though it is cold, not from asphyxiation, though you cannot breathe, from the pressure differential. Your body expects 101,000 pascals. Mars gives you 600. The difference is catastrophic. This is not speculation. This has been studied. We know what happens to humans exposed to vacuum. There have been accidents in altitude chambers, explosive decompression events. The physics is clear. You cannot survive exposure to Mars's surface pressure, so you need a pressure suit, or a habitat, something to maintain pressure. Here is where the engineering problem becomes a physics problem. A habitat on Mars has to hold pressure. Internal pressure of about 101,000 pascals, external pressure of 600 pascals. That's a pressure difference of 100,400 pascals, about 1 atmosphere of pressure differential. 1 atmosphere does not sound like much. You live under 1 atmosphere of pressure right now, and you don't feel it because it's balanced. The air inside you pushes out with the same pressure the air outside pushes in. But a pressure differential is different. That's force, unbalanced force, trying to equalize. And force over area is pressure, but it also translates to structural stress. Every square meter of habitat wall on Mars experiences about 100,000 newtons of force pushing outward. That's the weight of about 10 tons pressing on every square meter of wall, trying to push it outward, trying to rupture it. For comparison, an airliner at cruising altitude has a pressure differential of about 0.6 atmospheres. The cabin is pressurized to roughly 80,000 pascals, while the outside air at 35,000 feet is about 25,000 pascals. Engineers design aircraft to handle that differential. They use cylindrical structures, strong materials, careful sealing, and even then, metal fatigue is a constant concern. Fuselages develop cracks. Inspections are mandatory. Maintenance is continuous. A Mars habitat has nearly twice the pressure differential of an airliner, and it cannot be maintained easily. No technicians can come out and inspect every seal, every weld, every structural joint. You are on Mars, 140 million miles from the nearest repair facility. If the structure fails, everyone inside dies. And structures on Mars face additional stresses. Temperature swings from 100 degrees at night to pleasant 20 degrees during the day, thermal expansion and contraction, dust storms that last weeks, sandblasting the exterior, micrometeorite impacts, UV radiation degrading materials, cosmic rays causing cumulative damage to polymers and composites. You are trying to maintain a pressure vessel in one of the most hostile environments imaginable, with no backup, no replacement parts beyond what you brought, and no margin for error. A single crack, a single failed seal, a single weak point, and the habitat depressurizes. And depressurization at 1 atmosphere differential is not slow, it is explosive. The air rushes out at hundreds of meters per second. Anyone inside has seconds to respond. If they cannot get to a pressure suit or a sealed emergency shelter, they die. This is not an engineering challenge that can be solved with better design. This is a fundamental consequence of the pressure differential. The habitat is, by necessity, a pressurized vessel operating under constant stress in an environment that wants to destroy it. And the penalty for failure is immediate and total. Now let's talk about radiation. Earth has a magnetic field. It deflects most of the charged particles coming from the sun and from deep space. The particles that do get through are mostly absorbed by the atmosphere. By the time you're standing on the surface, the radiation exposure is minimal. You receive a dose of about 2 to 3 millisieverts per year from cosmic rays and natural background radiation. Mars has no magnetic field, or rather, it has remnants of an ancient magnetic field, localized and weak, not enough to provide any protection. And Mars's atmosphere, as we've established, is negligible. It blocks almost nothing. So cosmic radiation hits the surface of Mars directly. Galactic cosmic rays, high-energy protons and atomic nuclei, traveling at nearly the speed of light, originating from supernovae and other violent events across the galaxy. These particles have enough energy to pass through solid matter, through spacecraft walls, through habitat walls, through your body. The radiation dose on the Martian surface is about 0.67 millisieverts per day. That's roughly 250 millisieverts per year, about 100 times higher than on Earth. For comparison, the annual limit for radiation workers on Earth is 50 millisieverts. Mars exceeds that in about 10 weeks. The lifetime limit for astronauts is around 1,000 millisieverts. On Mars, you would hit that in about 4 years. And those are the limits based on cancer risk. But radiation does not just increase cancer risk. High-energy particles cause direct damage to DNA. They create double-strand breaks. Cells can repair some of this damage, but not all of it. Cumulative exposure leads to increased mutation rates, cellular dysfunction, tissue damage. Radiation also affects the brain. Studies on astronauts exposed to high radiation environments show cognitive decline, memory problems, slower reaction times, changes in brain structure visible on MRI. The mechanisms are not fully understood, but the effects are real. High-energy particles passing through neural tissue cause damage that the brain cannot fully repair. You cannot shield against this easily. You can build thick walls, pile up regolith, use water as shielding. But galactic cosmic rays are so energetic that stopping them requires meters of material. And even then, some particles get through. Worse, when high-energy particles hit heavy nuclei in the shielding material, they can create secondary particles, sometimes making the radiation dose inside the shielding higher than outside. So you cannot build a habitat with comfortable levels of radiation shielding unless you bury it deep underground or pile several meters of regolith on top. Both options are possible, but they are not simple. They require massive construction efforts, heavy equipment, energy, time. And even then, you have only reduced the dose, not eliminated it. Living on Mars means living with chronic radiation exposure far above anything considered safe on Earth. Every day, for years, with no escape. And the long-term effects on human health, especially for children developing in that environment, are unknown because we have never tested it. Now let's talk about gravity. Mars's gravity is 38% of Earth's. Stand on Mars, and you weigh 38% of what you weigh on Earth. Sounds convenient. Easier to move around. Less strain on joints, except your body is not designed for 38% gravity. Your body is designed for 100% gravity. Every system, cardiovascular, musculoskeletal, vestibular, evolved under one standard gravity. And when you remove that, things break. We know what happens in microgravity. Astronauts on the International Space Station lose bone density at about 1% per month. Muscle mass decreases. The heart weakens because it does not have to work as hard to pump blood. Fluids shift toward the head, causing vision problems. The vestibular system, which relies on gravity to sense orientation, becomes confused. Astronauts returning from 6 months in space need weeks of rehabilitation to regain normal function. That's in microgravity. Essentially zero gravity. What about 38% gravity? We don't know. We have never tested it. No one has ever lived in 38% gravity for an extended period. We have no data, no experiments, no studies. It is possible that 38% gravity is enough to prevent the worst effects of microgravity. It is also possible that it is not. It is possible that 38% gravity causes different problems, slower bone loss but still significant over years, cardiovascular changes that are less severe but still debilitating, or maybe it is fine. Maybe 38% is enough to keep the body functioning normally. We do not know, and we will not know until someone tries it. Which means the first people to live on Mars long-term are experimental subjects. Their bodies will provide the data, and if 38% gravity is not enough, if the long-term effects are severe, then living on Mars becomes even more difficult. You would need artificial gravity, rotating habitats, something to simulate Earth's gravity, all of which adds mass, complexity, energy requirements, and cost. Or you accept that people living on Mars will suffer long-term physiological decline. Weaker bones, weaker muscles, cardiovascular problems, vision degradation, and they can never return to Earth because their bodies will no longer be able to handle full gravity. That is not a life. That is a slow deterioration with no exit. Now let's talk about breathing. You need oxygen. Your body consumes about 550 liters of oxygen per day. That oxygen has to come from somewhere. On Earth, you breathe air. The atmosphere is 21% oxygen at 101,000 pascals, which gives a partial pressure of about 21,000 pascals. Your lungs are designed to extract oxygen at that partial pressure. On Mars, you need to create that environment artificially. You need to produce oxygen, compress it, and maintain it at the right pressure inside your habitat or suit. Producing oxygen on Mars is possible. The atmosphere is mostly carbon dioxide. You can split CO2 into carbon and oxygen using a process called electrolysis or chemical reduction, but it requires energy, a lot of energy. Splitting 1 kilogram of CO2 into oxygen requires about 2.75 kilowatt hours of energy, assuming 100% efficiency. In reality, the process is maybe 70% efficient, so closer to 4 kilowatt hours per kilogram of oxygen. An average human consumes about 0.84 kilograms of oxygen per day. That's about 3.4 kilowatt hours per person per day, just to produce breathable oxygen. That does not sound like much, but remember, you also need energy for heat, light, water recycling, food production, equipment operation, communications. A single person on Mars might require 20 to 50 kilowatt hours per day of total energy, depending on the systems. Where does that energy come from? Solar panels, nuclear reactors. Those are the only realistic options. Solar panels on Mars receive about 43% of the sunlight they would receive on Earth, and dust storms can block sunlight for weeks. Nuclear reactors are reliable, but require fuel, shielding, cooling, and maintenance. Either way, energy is the bottleneck. Every breath you take, every degree of warmth, every liter of water recycled, every gram of food grown, all of it requires energy. And energy on Mars is expensive. Every watt of generating capacity has to be brought from Earth or built on Mars using materials mined, refined, and assembled with equipment that also had to be brought from Earth. You are trying to sustain human life in an environment where nothing is free. Everything costs energy, and energy costs mass, and mass costs fuel to launch from Earth. The rocket equation applies to every component, every backup system, every spare part. Let me make this concrete. A single human needs, at minimum, about 2 kilograms of oxygen, 4 kilograms of water, and 1 kilogram of food per day. That's 7 kilograms per day of consumables for one person. If you want to support that person for 1 year, you need 2,555 kilograms of consumables, over 2.5 tons, for one person, for 1 year. You cannot bring that from Earth. The cost is prohibitive, so you have to produce it on Mars, which requires equipment, oxygen generators, water extractors, greenhouses or food production systems, power generation. All of that equipment has mass, and all of it has to be transported from Earth, even with in situ resource utilization, producing water from ice deposits, producing oxygen from the atmosphere, growing food in hydroponic systems. The mass of the equipment required is enormous. Estimates for a self-sustaining Mars base supporting even a dozen people run into hundreds of tons of equipment, all of which has to be launched, landed, assembled, and maintained. And that is assuming everything works. No failures, no breakdowns, no unexpected problems, in an environment where a failure can kill everyone in hours. Now let's talk about what happens when something breaks. On Earth, if your water purifier breaks, you call a technician, or you buy a new one, or you drink bottled water until it is fixed. Inconvenient, but not life-threatening. On Mars, if your water purifier breaks, you have a fixed amount of time before you die of dehydration. Maybe a few days if you have reserves. You cannot call a technician. You cannot order a replacement. You either fix it yourself with the parts you have, or you die. Every system is critical: life support, power, thermal control, pressure maintenance. If any of them fail completely, the habitat becomes uninhabitable. And the failure modes are not always obvious. A slow leak in the pressure system, a gradual decline in oxygen production, a creeping buildup of CO2 that the scrubbers cannot handle. By the time you notice, it might be too late. You need redundancy, backup systems, spare parts. But redundancy adds mass. Every backup system is another thing you have to launch from Earth. Every spare part is more mass, more cost, more complexity. And even with redundancy, you cannot plan for everything. Equipment fails in unexpected ways. Materials degrade, seals crack, electronics corrode, dust infiltrates mechanisms. You are operating in an environment that is actively hostile to machinery, and you have limited ability to repair or replace anything. This is not a sustainable model. This is a survival model. You are constantly fighting entropy, constantly maintaining, constantly replacing. And the moment you fall behind, the moment something critical breaks and you cannot fix it, everyone dies. Here is the part nobody wants to say out loud. Mars is not a second Earth. It is not a backup planet. It is not a place where humans can live normally, the way we live on Earth. Earth is not just a rock with an atmosphere. Earth is a living system, a biosphere that has been producing oxygen for billions of years. An ecosystem that recycles water, nutrients, organic matter, automatically, continuously, at planetary scale. A magnetic field generated by a molten core, an atmosphere thick enough to shield the surface from radiation and maintain stable pressure. All of that is infrastructure, planetary scale infrastructure. And it is free. You did not build it, you did not maintain it. It was already here, functioning, when humans evolved. Mars has none of that. Mars is a dead planet. No biosphere, no magnetic field, almost no atmosphere, no water cycle, no oxygen production, no natural recycling of anything. If you want those things, you have to build them, artificially, from scratch, and maintain them, forever. That is the scale of the task. You are not just building a base. You are trying to replicate planetary-scale life support with human-made systems, using resources that have to be mined and refined on a planet with no infrastructure, powered by energy sources that have to be brought from Earth or built from scratch, maintained by people who are already struggling to survive in an environment that is trying to kill them. And you are doing this 140 million miles from the nearest source of help, with no resupply, no backup, no possibility of evacuation if things go wrong. Now let's talk about children. If you want a permanent colony, eventually people will have children. That is the definition of permanent, a population that can reproduce and sustain itself. But we have no idea what happens to a developing fetus in 38% gravity, no idea what happens to a growing child. Bone development, cardiovascular development, neurological development, all of these processes are influenced by gravity. Remove gravity and things go wrong. But we do not know what happens at 38% gravity because no one has ever tested it. And radiation. A developing fetus is far more sensitive to radiation than an adult. Radiation causes developmental defects, genetic damage, increased cancer risk. On Mars, a pregnant woman would be exposing her developing child to radiation levels 100 times higher than on Earth. For 9 months, we have no data on what that does. We can guess that it is bad, but we do not know how bad. And even if the child is born healthy, they grow up in 38% gravity. Their bones develop in low gravity, their muscles, their cardiovascular system. If they ever want to visit Earth, can they? Can a person who grew up in 38% gravity survive in 100% gravity? Or are they permanently adapted to Mars, unable to leave? You are not just sending people to Mars, you are creating a population that might be physically incapable of living anywhere else. A population that is trapped by biology, by physics. That is not colonization, that is exile. Here is what you are left with. Living on Mars is not a matter of building better habitats or developing better technology. The problems are not engineering problems. They are physics problems. The atmosphere is too thin. You cannot breathe it. You cannot survive exposure to it. You need constant pressurization, which is difficult and dangerous. The radiation is too high. You cannot shield it completely. Living on Mars means chronic exposure to levels of radiation that cause long-term health damage. The gravity is too low. We do not know if 38% gravity is sufficient for long-term health. We do not know what it does to developing children. The energy cost is too high. Every breath, every drop of water, every gram of food, every watt of heat, all of it requires energy that has to be generated or brought from Earth. The failure modes are catastrophic. A single critical system failure can kill everyone. And redundancy is expensive in mass, which is expensive in launch cost, which is expensive in money. And all of this assumes perfect execution. No mistakes, no unexpected failures, no Murphy's Law. In reality, things go wrong. Equipment fails. People make errors. And on Mars, there is no safety net, no rescue, no second chances. This is not pessimism. This is physics. And physics does not care about optimism or ambition or the dream of becoming a multiplanetary species. Physics cares about pressure differentials, radiation doses, energy budgets, and structural limits. And the physics of Mars is unforgiving. You can visit Mars. You can build a research base. You can send rotating crews who stay for a few months and then return to Earth. But living on Mars, raising families, creating a self-sustaining society, that is not a matter of willpower or technology. That is a matter of accepting long-term health consequences, severe environmental hazards, and the reality that Mars will never be Earth. Maybe we will solve some of these problems. Maybe we will develop better radiation shielding, artificial gravity, closed-loop life support that actually works long-term, maybe. But right now the physics says no. And until the physics changes, living on Mars is not a frontier. It is a slow death in a hostile environment, far from home, with no way back. Reality does not care what we want. It only cares what the laws of physics allow. And the laws of physics say that Mars is not a home. It is a place humans might survive barely for a while at enormous cost. But it is not a place we can live. Not the way we live on Earth. Not without changing what it means to be human. And maybe that is the real question. Not whether we can live on Mars, but whether what we become in order to survive there is still us.